At the height of a Gulf summer when the air outside sits somewhere around 40 degrees Celsius, a Boeing 777 comes in low over the Qatari desert and touches down at Doha. A freighter, no passengers, no luggage, no duty-free. Inside the hold, standing in padded stalls and breathing conditioned air, are dairy cows. Holsteins, the big black and white ones you picture in a wet green field somewhere in Europe. They have just been flown across a continent to a country made mostly of sand, and this plane has about 60 siblings. Over the following months, an airline better known for champagne and flatbeds would carry roughly 4,000 live cows into one of the hottest places on Earth, one plane load at a time. So, what has to go wrong in a country before somebody says the words out loud, "Put the cows on planes"? This was no stunt. A wealthy nation had just discovered in a single morning how much of its dinner depended on one road it did not control. And the way the story ends is stranger than the airlift. To understand the cows, you have to start with a map, and with one very specific line on it. Qatar is a peninsula. It juts out into the Gulf, and it touches land in exactly one place, its border with Saudi Arabia. One border, one road in. Everything else is water or sky. For decades, that line was simply a fact of the map, and nobody lost any sleep over it. Qatar imported almost all of its food, the way a lot of wealthy desert states do, and an enormous share of it came across that single line on the map, on trucks, every single day. Fresh milk especially. Milk does not keep. It cannot sit on a ship for 3 weeks. It came over the border from Saudi dairies, and it was on Qatari shelves the same week. Then, on the 5th of June, 2017, that road closed. It happened in the early hours, by announcement, with no warning to the people who would live with it. Drivers who had run that route their whole working lives turned up to find the crossing shut. Trucks that had left the day before were stranded on the wrong side of a line that had been meaningless the previous afternoon. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt severed relations with Qatar and shut it out. The land border was sealed. Airspace was closed to Qatari planes. Neighboring ports stopped handling Qatari shipping, forcing cargo onto longer routes through Oman. A political dispute had, overnight, turned into a physical one. And a country feels a thing like that in the dairy aisle long before it feels it in a government building.
The big news is Saudi Arabia, which is a fellow GCC country, which was the first to cut ties. What it means is obviously Qatar is becoming isolated diplomatically from its immediate neighbors, and we'll have to see what other countries do in terms of what kind of decision they make. But the big thing is that these are all apart from Egypt, these are all GCC countries which have cut ties, and that's a huge thing because they have a lot of economic and deep political ties with Qatar.
Within days, the pictures came out of Doha supermarkets, and they are the kind of pictures that stay with you because they are so ordinary. Shoppers with full carts, long queues, and behind them, refrigerated shelves stripped down to bare metal. No famine caused that. Nobody in Doha was starving. The fresh milk in that country simply had one supplier, and that supplier had just become a rival.
Store shelves are quickly running empty in Qatar. 4 Middle Eastern countries broke relations with the tiny Persian Gulf nation Monday: Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Yemen's internationally backed government followed suit. The countries closed land, sea, and air routes to Qatar, meaning food can't get in. Flights are also grounded as airports were thrown into chaos. The countries blamed Qatar's relationship with Iran and its alleged support for Islamic extremist groups.
This is the thing about modern food that almost nobody thinks about until the day it stops. The system does not fail slowly. There is no warning light. One morning the trucks simply do not come, and a wealthy, modern, air-conditioned city discovers that its breakfast was arriving on somebody else's road. Qatar had money. It had one of the highest incomes per person in the world. What it did not have that week was milk. And that is the exact moment somebody looked at the problem and decided that the answer was aviation. The plan went public about a week into the blockade, and when it did, most people assumed it was a joke. A Qatari businessman named Moutaz Al Khayyat, chairman of a company called Power International Holding, told reporters that he was going to fly cows in. Not a few, 4,000 of them. He said it would take as many as 60 flights. Read that back slowly, because the logistics are absurd. A dairy cow weighs somewhere in the region of 600 kilos, a living animal with a nervous system and a very specific opinion about being loaded into an aircraft. Feed her in the air. Water her in the air. Keep her cool. Do not stack her, because she is not a pallet. Then open the door onto a country whose summer heat is, from her body's point of view, close to hostile. Every part of this is harder and more expensive than simply buying milk. That was the point. Buying milk was the thing that had just been taken away. The first shipments landed in July of 2017, and this part comes from the airline itself. Qatar Airways Cargo put out a press release about it, a national carrier announcing in the flat language of a corporate statement that it had just moved its first Holsteins from Europe on a Boeing 777 freighter, the opening batch of a 4,000-head herd. That is a sentence worth sitting with. A luxury airline, one of the most awarded in the world, describing a cattle drive at 30,000 feet.
The cabin is full. The hold loaded. The only thing missing are the passengers. And for Qatar Airways, this is part of the new normal.
The story is fairly simple. The world has stopped traveling in 2020, but the world has not stopped trading. My name is Guillaume Alleux. I'm the Chief Officer Cargo for Qatar Airways. When the pandemic hit, clearly the business model that we were operating was no longer valid. The business model of Qatar Airways was 60 cargo flights per day and close to 600 passenger flights per day. Those passenger flights almost disappeared, almost overnight.
Picture the loading. A wide-body freighter has a main deck the length of a swimming pool, and on an ordinary night, it swallows pallets of electronics and cut flowers and machine parts. On these nights, it swallowed livestock, ramps up to the cargo door, handlers moving animals that had never seen a runway, let alone stood on one, stalls braced against the deck so that nothing shifts when the aircraft rotates and climbs. And then, several hours in the dark at altitude, with the air system holding a European spring inside an aluminum tube crossing the Middle East. The animals flew in specially prepared stalls. The holds were climate-controlled. Ground crews met them in the middle of a Gulf summer and walked them straight into cooled barns. In July, the few hundred meters between the aircraft door and the shed were among the most dangerous ground those animals would ever cross. Flight after flight, through the back half of that year, the herd assembled itself in the desert, a dairy industry, arriving by air, in pieces. But a plane full of cows still only gets you cows. The harder problem sat waiting on the ground. Quick thing while the planes are still landing. I am genuinely curious where you are watching this from, so drop your country in the comments. I do read them. All right. Back to the desert. Here is the part that gets skipped in the funny version of this story. You cannot fly 4,000 cows into a country and park them. A dairy at that scale is a factory. Cooled barns because a Holstein is a northern European animal, and heat stress shuts her milk down. Milking parlors running around the clock. Water in a place with almost none of it. Refrigeration, packaging, trucks. Everything that gets milk from the animal to the shelf before it turns. All of that had to be built at emergency speed, at the same time as the herd was still arriving. The company that did it was called Baladna, which simply means our country, and by late 2017, Baladna was publicly saying it intended to make Qatar self-sufficient in fresh milk and dairy by the middle of 2018. Its own figures put the country's total demand at around 400 tons of fresh milk and dairy a day. 400 tons a day, from a standing start, in sand. That sounds like the kind of promise that quietly gets forgotten. Qatar kept it.
Baladna is Qatar's leading and largest dairy producer. Home to more than 25,000 Holstein cows, the company produces 150 million litres of milk each year. It came to life following the 2017 blockade when the company airlifted 4,000 cows to Qatar. It now supplies more than 70% of the country's fresh dairy products.
This is where the story stops being funny, because the ridiculous plan did the thing it said it would do. Qatar went from stripped shelves to filling its own dairy aisle, and it did it in roughly a year. The farm north of Doha kept growing after the emergency was over. Today, it is one of the largest cattle farms in the region, home to something in the order of 24,000 cows living in temperature-controlled barns, in a country whose summer air would put a Holstein into dangerous heat stress within hours. Baladna went from an emergency measure to a company listed on Qatar's stock exchange. The blockade had been designed to squeeze. Instead, it built a competitor, which is where most versions of this story stop. Funny plan, happy ending, cows in the desert. Except the interesting part had not happened yet. In January of 2021, the blockade was lifted. The country signed a declaration, the border reopened, the planes could fly over Saudi airspace again. The crisis that built Baladna simply stopped existing.
Saudi Arabia reopening its borders with Qatar, taking the first step towards ending a diplomatic crisis that has divided regional U.S. allies. The state-run Kuwait news agency reported the announcement. Qatar's only land border has been mostly closed since 2017, when Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, and Bahrain launched a blockade against the tiny Gulf state, accusing it of supporting Islamist groups. Now, Qatar has always rejected that claim.
And the farm did not shrink, it expanded. Baladna had already gone public on Qatar's stock exchange by then. An emergency dairy turned into a listed company with shareholders and a growth plan. It kept adding animals. It started looking outward, at supply deals and projects well beyond a peninsula that had, a few years earlier, simply wanted milk in the fridge by Thursday. Because somewhere in those 3.5 years, the project quietly changed what it was for. It started as survival. It ended up as something closer to a statement. A country demonstrating in concrete and cattle that it could never be squeezed that way again. The milk was almost beside the point. The point was that nobody would ever get to turn the tap off. That is a very expensive kind of insurance, and it raises the question that this whole story has been circling. Because here is the uncomfortable arithmetic underneath the triumph. Milk from a cow standing in a cooled barn in the Qatari desert is not cheap milk. Every liter of it carries a share of the air conditioning, the water, the imported animals, the flights, the infrastructure, and the sheer physical work of holding a northern European climate in place inside a Gulf summer. In a normal market, milk like that struggles to compete with milk from a field where the grass grows for free. So this was never really an agricultural decision. It was a strategic one. Qatar did not build a dairy because a dairy was the best use of the money. It built a dairy because the alternative was depending on a neighbor who had just proved willing to close the road. And nobody in Doha was pretending otherwise. A country that can afford to fly in a herd is buying something other than breakfast. It is buying the right to stop asking permission. And once you see that, you start seeing it everywhere. A lot of what looks like farming in the modern world is barely about food. It is about who gets to close the road and what a country will spend so that nobody can. Qatar got lucky in one specific way, and it is worth naming. Milk was a problem you could solve by air. Cows fit in a plane. A dairy fits on a patch of desert. The whole thing was expensive and strange, but it was possible, and it was fast enough to matter. Not everything on that shelf is like that. You cannot airlift a wheat harvest. You cannot fly in a growing season. If the thing that gets cut off is grain or fertilizer or the water underneath the ground, there is no Boeing that fixes it in a year. So the real lesson of the cows has nothing to do with Qatar being clever. Qatar found out. It got a live demonstration, at fairly low cost, of exactly how thin the line runs between a modern supermarket and a stripped shelf, and then spent every year since building against it. Most countries have not had that demonstration yet. They are running the same arrangement Qatar was running on the 4th of June, 2017. Food arriving from somewhere else, on somebody else's road, on the assumption that the road stays open. The cows on the plane look absurd until you ask the only question that matters. If your road closed tomorrow, what is on your shelf a week later? And who exactly would have to say yes before it got refilled? If this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe. That is genuinely all it takes to keep this going.